Okay, super. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? So, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy evenings. My name is Connor Downs. I'm the Vice President here at MD Biologics, Canada's regenerative medicine partner. Now, tonight's webinar topic is peptides in regenerative medicine. Now, peptides are, quite frankly, a polarizing topic. However, based on the turnout tonight and my discussions with many of you, they're also something that many of you are fielding questions about daily. Questions from patients, from colleagues, and from the growing volume of information about them online. Now, some of that information is excellent, and a lot of it is not. And we feel at MD Biologics like the clinicians asking those questions deserve a credible, evidence-based resource to draw from. So that's what tonight is all about. This is an educational session designed to help you understand the current science, the applications, as well as, most importantly, the regulatory status for peptides, specifically BPC 157 and GHK copper. In Canada, for any of our American colleagues that have joined tonight, we will be speaking through the lens of the Canadian regulatory landscape. Ultimately, so that you and your patients can make better and more informed decisions. So you will see a disclaimer here on the screen. Everything that's discussed tonight is for educational purposes and does not constitute prescriptive medical advice. With that said, let me introduce some of the people who will make tonight's content worth your time. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce Grant Pagdin, who, if many of you have joined our webinars in the past, will be a familiar voice for many of you. Grant, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your experience with this space, not just within peptide science, but within regenerative medicine as a whole?
Sure. Thanks very much, Connor. And thank you so much for hosting this webinar tonight. Clearly, we've got a lot of interest. All of my colleagues are hearing about peptides from their patients, and they just want to have some credible information. I'm based here in Kelowna, British Columbia, and my background is anti-aging and regenerative medicine. I've been working with PRP and stem cells for over a decade now. I have a registered clinical trial approved by Health Canada for the use of stem cells in osteoarthritis, and I'm harvesting stem cells both from fat and from bone marrow for that purpose. So the latest thing that came across my desk is, what about these regenerative peptides? So that's really what the topic is today. And I'm hoping my colleague, Dr. Trevor Hoffman, is going to be able to join us as well. He sits with me on the board of directors with the Canadian Peptide Research Society. And the third member of our board is our compounding pharmacist, Chris Campaignin. I'm hoping that he's also going to be able to join us today. So the Canadian Peptide Research Society was born out of basically the need for reputable resources in the peptide space. Because what you see when you log on online is you see these lay people that are biohackers that claim to have lots of experience. And that's who our patients are listening to. We wanted to try to put together some medical evidence for the use of these, and also to kind of try to move the science forward with legitimate data tracking for outcomes. So basically that's what I'm all about.
Great. Do you mind just speaking a little bit more to your engagement with Health Canada? Obviously, you mentioned that you're involved in a clinical trial. You're communicating consistently with Health Canada. Can you speak a little bit more to your involvement there as well as within the clinical publication space?
Sure. So I had a background in clinical research before I started this project with stem cells. I worked for a clinical research organization doing a lot of pharmaceutical research. So I was involved in about 39 trials as either a sub-investigator or a co-investigator. And then when Health Canada intervened in the stem cell space in 2019, they lowered the boom on us and they said, if you're going to use these biologic products for the treatment of osteoarthritis, you need to file a new drug application or a clinical trial application. So because of my experience in clinical trials, I was the first in Canada to file a clinical trial application. I got a no objection letter from Health Canada at the beginning of 2020, and I've been doing research in this field ever since. Last year, we just had an audit with Health Canada, so I know really exactly what they're looking for to run a really solid clinical trial. We passed our audit, by the way, and we actually appealed to Health Canada to be able to extend our clinical trial. So we initially had a cohort of 240 subjects. Now we're going to be out to 360. I do all the peripheral joints, shoulders, elbows, wrists, hips, knees, and ankles, combinations of PRP and either lipoaspirate or bone marrow aspirate or all three. So so I have lots of background in what it takes to do clinical research.
Yeah, super. And as Dr. Pagdin said, we're hoping that Dr. Hoffman will be able to join us. If he does, then we will bring him front and center to share his experience. But this will be an interactive discussion between Grant and myself, as well as Dr. Hoffman and Chris once they're able to join us. So here's our roadmap for tonight. You can see the session structure here on the left, as well as the most common questions. Now, we have a ton of people on the webinar tonight. Many of you were generous enough to submit some of your questions about peptides in advance. A lot of themes emerged, themes specific to the human evidence, the legal and regulatory structure around prescribing these in Canada, how we can communicate with patients, local versus systemic, oral versus injectable as far as administration, obviously safety risks, including those that stem from malignant growths, where to access and source peptides in Canada, if that's something you're interested in, as well as ultimately where these may fit into your toolkit within the musculoskeletal space. So first and foremost, we are going to do a quick review, a quick science review on what are peptides. So a very simple question, Grant. What does the audience need to understand about what exactly peptides are?
Well, oftentimes our patients are actually better informed in this area than we are. They come to us with these things that they've read, and the physician is kind of on their back foot, trying to play catch up here. So the ones that we've all heard about are the GLP-1 agonists. We know that they have the approval for diabetes. Now, there's also some of them that have made the transition now to being approved for weight management. So most of us are conversant with the GLP-1 agonists. They've been on the market now for some time. There are certain peptides that we are able to use for the stimulation of growth hormone production. And so one of the ones that we can get compounded is sermorelin, which is a growth hormone releasing peptide. It's used as a sublingual troche at bedtime. It is something that we can compound, and it's legal to use in Canada. You need to be tracking the IGF-1 if you're going to use any of these growth hormone peptides, and they are not likely to result in supraphysiologic production of growth hormone, but the potential side effects would include fluid retention and joint pain. And then finally, the regenerative peptides, which is what we're focusing on today. So things like BPC 157, GHK copper, TB500 or TB4, which is called thymazine beta. We're not really going to get too much into that one today. That is not one that we are able to compound. This is some of the spectrum of things that our patients are learning about online and coming to us with their questions.
Fantastic. And so let's just start off before we get into some of the science and some of the clinical protocols, the way that these compounds are being used. Let's first cover off the regulatory picture. And, we understand that a lot of these GLP-1s are already approved on the market as drugs. Let's focus in on things like BPC 157 and GHK copper. What is the current regulatory status for these in Canada?
So here's the story. Even though our compounding pharmacy has the permission required to create sterile injectable BPC 157, oral capsules of BPC 157, and topical preparations of GHK copper, that does not mean that these are approved for use or for prescribing. They technically can't be prescribed as off-label because they're unapproved substances that are currently outside the regulatory framework. Off-label prescribing involves using an approved medication for an indication or a dose or a population that was not initially specified in the approved labeling. Okay, so off-labeling is common medical practice. We do that routinely. But in contrast, prescribing an unapproved drug like BPC 157 involves somewhat different regulatory, legal, and ethical considerations. So that's a large part of what we want to talk about tonight. Their use in human conditions is confined to clinical research. And that requires a number of important elements that we're going to dig into a little bit. At the very minimum, we need to firstly document a robust, informed consent discussion with our patients that includes a discussion of all the possible alternatives, all the known risks, and then secondary, we need a mechanism for tracking outcomes, both good and bad. And ideally, you want to use a validated symptom tracking tool. Now, we also need to make sure that we have standardized manufacturing quality controls that ensure the consistency of the product. So these are the ingredients that the Canadian Peptide Research Society has taken pains to develop, and these are available on our website for members. Now, the additional ingredients in clinical research that we are exploring would include the oversight of an ethics board and the possibility of filing a formal clinical trial application with Health Canada, which is what I've done in the stem cell arena. Now, to do those two remaining things, we would need to secure some substantial funding. So the Canadian Peptide Research Society is in the process of searching out funding to be able to pursue a clinical trial of that nature. But at the very least, robust informed consent and outcomes tracking. Okay. Now, we talked a little bit about the distinction between approved pharmaceutical peptides and things that you can get online as research only. The peptides that you purchase on the internet would typically come with a disclaimer that says they are for research purposes only, either for in vitro or for animal studies, and they are not to be used in humans. So when you buy those, you sign a disclaimer that says you're not using them in humans, okay? They don't typically come with any batch numbers or lot numbers. Quality control is marginal. Some companies will produce you a third-party testing certificate, and the authenticity of these certificates is often in question, okay, because they can be forged. Unregulated manufacturing runs the risk of potential contamination, inaccurate labeling, and sometimes, frankly, just counterfeit products, right? So the peptides that you would obtain from our local compounding pharmacist are guaranteed for purity and sterility with local testing of every batch. So I would steer you clear of buying peptides online that are research only, and I would suggest sourcing your peptides from a certified compounding pharmacy. The final caveat here that I wanted to stress is that the things we're talking about today are for educational purposes, for research purposes, and we have to be very careful about making any unverified therapeutic claims, okay? So these peptides do not have the required approval for the treatment of any particular medical condition. Using them in a research fashion in your musculoskeletal practice is acceptable, provided you've got the informed consent and a mechanism for tracking outcomes. That's the very minimum required to be doing clinical research, okay? You need to explicitly disclose to the patient that BPC 157 and GHK copper are not approved products. They lack comprehensive human safety and efficacy data. They might pose unknown risks, okay? Now, I can satisfy myself that these items are very low risk because both of these peptides that we're focused on today are actually naturally occurring substances in the human body. Your body makes them, it knows what to do with them. So the next step is we're gonna jump into a little bit more of what exactly is the physiology, what exactly are these molecules, and how do they work. But basically, Canadian Peptide Research Society is here together with MD Biologics to help to give you the information about what is going on in the peptide space so that you can make some informed decisions about whether you might want to incorporate some of these complementary strategies in your practice of musculoskeletal medicine, giving you access to some protocols, some tracking tools, and some literature, and then you can make your own decision as to whether you're prepared to accept some of the risk associated with prescribing unregulated and unapproved medications.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Pagdin. I'll add two quick comments. I know that we have a number of our sports medicine colleagues on the webinar tonight. The use of peptides is a banned substances of 2022 within the World Anti-Doping Agency. And so in addition to everything that's been discussed here tonight, if you are responsible for professional athletes and they feel like they want to take it upon themselves in order to pursue some of these new therapeutics, they should be advised that this is on the WADA banned substances list. In addition to the above, as well as on the slide, we also note the US context simply for reference. This is something where we are seeing a trend towards more access rather than less. So again, more and more patients are going to be looking to what is going on in the US with respect to being able to access some of these assets.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Connor. So most people have heard already that RFK Jr. showed up on the Joe Rogan podcast to tell him that his intention was to move about 14 of these substances from category 2 back to category 1 so that they could be eligible for custom compounding. And they had been banned for some time. So we've been fortunate that we've been able to actually get BPC 157 in Canada, because for a number of months now, they haven't been able to get it in the US. It is moving back to category 1. Or at least that's the Joe Rogan podcast interpretation of what's going on in the regulatory landscape. It's shifting all the time.
And he is certainly not the subject matter expert here. So with a grain of salt, certainly we want to take Joe and his colleagues. Let's get into the science. So again, we're focused on BPC 157. We're focused on GHK copper. What is GHK copper? How is it being used? What are its potential applications? What is the mechanism of action here?
Sure. So do you want to touch on BPC 157 first and then move to GHK, or how do you want to?
Let's start with GHK and then BPC 157 will probably constitute a longer discussion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think really in the musculoskeletal space, probably GHK copper is going to have a little bit of a limited application, because at this point, we're only able to compound it in a topical formula and not an injectable formula. The GHK peptide contains 3 amino acids: glycine, histidine, and lysine, and it delivers copper as a cofactor, which is important in wound healing and angiogenesis. First discovered in 1973 by Dr. Lauren Pickart, it's found in our blood, saliva, and urine, where it occurs naturally. The level in the blood is about 200 nanograms per ml at the age of 20, but it declines to only about 80 nanograms per ml by the age of 60. Coinciding with a decline in our regenerative abilities as we age. So now, as collagen breaks down, GHK is actually released as a signal to help to stimulate the production of new collagen by activating the lysyl oxidase enzyme. It also activates superoxide dismutase, which helps eliminate free radicals, and cytochrome C oxidase, which increases mitochondrial function and improves blood flow. So in these ways, it can help with tissue healing. In animal studies, it's been shown to accelerate wound healing quite dramatically, even if it is injected somewhere distant in the body. So in vitro studies of human fibroblast cells have shown that the application of GHK copper will increase a chemical called transforming growth factor beta, which is involved in scar tissue formation. It's also been studied in the context of fibroblast cells from the cervix that have undergone radiation. The radiated cells, when treated with GHK, show much faster repair rates than similarly radiated cells not treated with GHK, and actually show similar growth rates to healthy cervix cells that were non-radiated. The mechanism of action is purported to be direct effects on DNA repair in the radiation damaged cells. In 2010, a study performed at MIT and Harvard using a computer program called the Broad Institute's Connectivity Map showed that GHK was able to increase the expression of DNA repair genes and turn off cancer genes better than any of other 1,300 bioactive molecules they studied. So I think there's a huge potential for GHK copper that's basically untapped. Again, we don't have an injectable form of GHK copper, so we are simply using that topically for wound healing. We're also using it to improve the cosmetic appearance of the skin. So it's very good for collagen and elastin. We use it topically on the skin after we do facial treatment with PRP, for instance. So that's kind of GHK copper in a nutshell. And now I'll talk a little bit about BPC 157. It's something that may have a little bit broader application, I think, in musculoskeletal medicine. BPC 157 is 15 amino acids long. It comes from our own gastric fluid. So it's a native protein that our body is used to. It was discovered by a Croatian scientist, Dr. Predrag Sikirk, in 1993. But actually, this work goes all the way back to 1904, when Dr. Pavlov won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for his work with salivation and gastric juices in dogs. So you all remember that experiment where Pavlov would ring a bell and the dog would salivate because they associated the bell with the dinner. Even if they didn't present the dinner, Ring the bell, the dog salivates. Well, he actually was using the gastric juice that he was collecting from his dogs for the treatment of a variety of medical conditions, including pernicious anemia, because of course the gastric juice contained the intrinsic factor necessary for the absorption of B12. And this was many years before the vitamin B12 was even discovered. So it also contained BPC 157, of course, but we did not have the technology to detect that at the time either. As we alluded to already, BPC 157 is not Health Canada approved for any indication. It lacks the approval of any other global regulatory authority like the FDA, because really there's insufficient comprehensive clinical studies confirming human benefit. Temporarily banned by WADA in 2022, as Connor mentioned, but actually it's not currently on the banned list, but tread cautiously with your competitive athletes, okay? BPC 157 has been shown to have many restorative properties, helps with tendon repair, ligaments, muscles, nerves, bone, fractures, teeth, and corneas, as well as the recovery from traumatic brain injury. Has a protective effect on the liver, the GI lining, particularly in the setting of NSAID-induced injury to the gut. Also helps healing endothelium. It can stimulate angiogenesis, but it's important to note that that's in a context-dependent manner, okay? So it will promote beneficial vessel formation, but oppose pathological neovascularization. So in wound healing models, it'll activate blood vessels that are running toward a tissue defect after a perforation injury. But in the setting of vessel obstruction, it will activate collateral vessels to bypass the occlusion. So it's kind of diverse effects across multiple tissue types. In the cornea, for instance, it will help to maintain corneal transparency without producing neovascularization. It has been shown to have powerful effects in inflammatory bowel disease, can help in the healing of fistulas. Topical treatment accelerates wound closure, particularly in burns and a unique burn with alkali. There's very little else that can assist the healing of an alkaline burn, but BPC 157 works in that setting. It's been shown to have anti-tumor effects. So I know that some of the questions before we even started this webinar were, what about the risk of cancer? So the blood vessel formation is in a context-dependent manner, and it's not associated with increasing the risk of tumors, at least in the preclinical work that's been done to date. Now, there's an additional mechanism of action of BPC 157 that can actually increase the expression of various genes that are involved in cellular stress response, proliferation, and differentiation. The effect of gene expression and molecular signaling underlies the broad healing capacities of this molecule. Now, in sports medicine, of course, we're primarily interested in healing soft tissue injuries and bones. BPC 157 lowers markers of inflammation like leukotriene B4, thromboxane B2, myeloperoxidase, stimulates the expression of early growth response 1 gene, which is involved in new cell growth, angiogenesis, and collagen formation. Now, the next question is, okay, what about the evidence? So there's preclinical evidence, and then there is just a very limited amount of human evidence. So with regard to safety, phase 2 study in animals showed they could not find a lethal dose. So there was no LD50, there was no LD1. They never killed an animal with this. They could not give enough of a dose to kill an animal. Humans have taken 1,000 times the recommended dose without any reported side effects. And as we all know, our bodybuilders and some of our competitive athletes have been using things like BPC 157 for over a decade to help with injury recovery. And this peptide has an excellent safety profile. This slide here shows a book by my colleague, Dr. Edwin Lee, who is a board-certified endocrinologist from Florida. I had the opportunity to take his peptide course when I was down in Salt Lake City in November with the compounding pharmacist, Chris Campaignan, who's also on my board of directors. We had the opportunity to take Dr. Lee out for dinner and ask him a few questions over dinner, which was great. He shared with us the results of his clinical trial, which is a published trial. If you search Dr. Edwin Lee, published trials on BPC 157, he treated a number of patients with knee pain. I think he had a total of 16 patients. 12 of them received BPC 157 alone, and the other 4 had a combination of BPC 157 with TB4, thymazine beta. Of the patients who received BPC alone, 11 out of 12 had a meaningful improvement in their pain scores at 6 months. And in the other group, 3 out of 4 had significant improvements at 6 months. He didn't register any side effects in any of those cases. So it's kind of a small case series. It was a retrospective study. It wasn't randomized or placebo controlled, but that's kind of what we've got for human safety data. And it was really neat to hear about that story directly from Dr. Lee himself. Chris and I asked him a second question, and this is something that came up in the questions as people were registering for the conference. And that question was, do you get any additional benefit if you would inject the BPC 157 directly into the injury rather than just giving it to the patient systemically, like a sub-Q injection in the abdomen? And Dr. Lee's answer to that question was very much so. I see a much greater benefit when I inject it directly into the area of injury. So his suggestion is to use sort of 3 to 4 times what would be the recommended daily dose as a single intra-articular injection or into an injury. And it can be combined with something like PRP. So that's something that I look forward to trialing in the near future. At this point, right now, I've been just using BPC 157 subcutaneously with a very small cohort of patients to help assist in musculoskeletal recovery.
So we've already touched a little bit on the BPC 157 safety profile, so we'll skip over this slide here. I know that there's likely to be some additional questions that we'll tackle as part of the Q&A. Broadly moving beyond the mechanistic data and recognizing that there is limited human data and even the preclinical data that exists, we're translating to the extent that we can with those models. But what are some of the proposed target applications for BPC 157?
So the kinds of things that have been clinically studied include tendons, ligaments, and joints in rodents. Okay, so we've got a good osteoarthritis model in a mouse. We put BPC 157 in the joint, and there's a substantial degree of recovery. Lacerated an Achilles tendon in a rat, apply BPC 157, and the tendon can reattach. So there's really been some dramatic animal studies here in terms of restoration of soft tissues and connective tissues. Each of the examples that you have listed here on this slide, Connor, are excellent targets for PRP, and they could equally be excellent targets for BPC 157, either with or without PRP.
So you mentioned PRP, and where does peptide therapy fit into the current orthobiologics toolkit, and how do you think about sequencing other orthobiologics with peptides, with the comments that you raised around how these peptides are being applied, the route of administration and such?
Yeah, well, we are fortunate to have quite a number of tools in the regenerative toolbox. And I think, most of our listeners today are going to be quite familiar with things like prolotherapy, PRP, shockwave ultrasound, red light therapy, and all the rehab protocols. So these experimental peptides are just kind of one more tool that we can add to the toolbox to help to promote better outcomes. So for the types of soft tissue injuries that you mentioned on the previous slide, my first go-to is high-dose PRP. So I'm looking to create a PRP that's somewhere between 5x to 15x baseline, depending on what I'm injecting. I want to get a really good dose of platelets delivered to that area. And then if I can optimize the outcome with an add-on like BPC 157, either injected systemically on a daily basis for maybe 6 weeks after a PRP injection, or combined directly with the PRP, either into the joint or into the injury, followed with a daily subcutaneous injection, then I think we can really help to facilitate healing.
And we'll touch on the route of administration in just a moment. Actually, why don't we jump to that now? Walk us through with respect to, you'd mentioned already using this subcutaneously. What are the other routes of administrations that people are looking to for peptides? I know we've had a few questions as well that were submitted in advance as far as local versus systemic, oral versus injectable. Can you walk us through what the data shows?
Yeah, so aside from just my anecdotal evidence in my conversation with Dr. Edwin Lee, I can't produce you any literature that shows that directly injecting the injury or the joint is superior to doing a subcutaneous systemic injection. Okay, so that's just anecdotal evidence, and to this at this point, I haven't yet started to incorporate localized or intra-articular injections into my protocol, but I hope to be doing that soon. So in terms of oral versus injectable, we are able to produce compounded capsules of BPC 157, and I find those to be a little bit more helpful with digestive issues. So if people have dyspepsia or have irritable colon or inflammatory bowel disease, oral is a reasonable way to present that. And now keep in mind that it is a substance that is manufactured in the gastric lining. It's part of the gastric juice. So your body is used to receiving it in the digestion and putting it to work rather than breaking it down. It's only 15 amino acids. So to some extent, it is going to be bioavailable when it's administered orally. However, if we're looking for musculoskeletal benefit, I really don't find that the oral capsules in my clinical experience are all that effective. And so I would encourage patients that are wanting to try one or the other. If it's for a musculoskeletal benefit, I would prefer a subcutaneous injection.
And what are the normal dosages as well as the duration the patients will remain on BPC 157 at that dose, and where's the therapeutic threshold in your experience?
Right. So there's not a sort of a really defined consensus out there. And as we've agreed, very little has been published. But the typical dosage range for BPC 157, if you're going to do a daily subcutaneous injection, 250 to 500 micrograms daily. If you're going to inject into an injury or a joint, it would be 1 to 2 milligrams. Okay. So Chris Campaignan is compounding a sterile solution of BPC 157 that is, I believe, 10 milligrams per ml. And that can be shipped anywhere in Canada if people are looking to get hold of a sterile, legitimate, pharmaceutical grade injectable.
Well, that sort of naturally segues into talking about supply and access, and I'll just raise the comment that this is important for both if you're not involved in or interested in getting directly involved in the supply chain as a physician. Certainly, you want to be aware of the different ways that patients may be accessing these peptides and be able to speak to and caution patients according to the known risks and the differences between these different channels for accessing peptides. Grant, so could you walk me through as a clinician what you're thinking about when you're looking at sourcing these peptides in Canada?
Sure. Well, obviously, my personal preference is I want to get them from a certified compounding pharmacy, right? I want to see a guarantee of purity and sterility where each vial is labeled with a lot number, right? When you buy this stuff on the internet, you don't know what you're getting. It could be completely counterfeit, could be contaminated with heavy metals, or bacteria or funguses, or who knows, right? Even if they provide you a third-party certificate of purity, who knows how many batches they tested, or whether that's even completely fabricated and just false. So there is a much greater risk, I think, in using an unregulated drug you buy off the internet versus something that is custom compounded in a sterile fashion. So I'm hoping that Chris Campaignan might be able to jump in here and chime in a little bit about what his challenges are around the consistency, the quality control, and obtaining these products. But I'm very fortunate that his pharmacy is just a few blocks away from my office here in Kelowna. And, he's just a great resource to have on the team.
Chris, I think I know we did have Chris. I think we still have Chris. Chris, if you're available to jump in, we'd love to hear from you as far as what your process looks like for producing BPC 157 in a secure and sterile environment. Just checking if there's anything that I need to click on my end to let us listen to what Chris has to say. Okay, Chris, we should have you now. I guess not. We'll keep troubleshooting this, Chris. Why don't you just shoot me a text message? We'll try to get you on here as soon as we can. Okay. Let's just keep things
Keep
rolling.
sure. Yeah. So bottom line, Connor, is really a pharmacy source is infinitely better than the internet source, right? The pharmacy is going to follow validated standard operating procedures, certificates of analysis. There's Chris.
We've got Chris. Chris,
Hi.
why don't you step in and take it from a professional's perspective, what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, my main mission so far has been able, to provide safe products. Obviously, there's a large number of people accessing these products on the gray market. And, on a daily basis, I have tons of stories of injection site injuries or just products not working. And a greater concern for me is the presence of endotoxins and whatnot that can be generated from the actual purification of the peptides themselves. And unless you're going through a valid supply chain, you have no idea what you are getting. So the most common feedback I get when I started supplying these, when they switched to my product versus online gray, was, whoa, okay, now I see what this does or that this is working. So I mean, that was obviously some great positive, anecdotal feedback for me. But overall, it's about providing safe products. So, as per what Dr. Pagdin alluded to, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of, I guess, which is regulation in general, and even, accessing the API itself. So we do have some channels set up for things that do have, some form of Health Canada approval. And obviously, as Dr. Pagdin mentioned, the BPC and the sermorelin are our two main candidates right now, and topical GHK Cu. We do sermorelin in an injectable as well. I know that wasn't mentioned earlier. So we do have injectable formats of BPC and sermorelin, and they are suspended in our sterile facility, meaning that you have a product that's safe. The concentration is exactly what's intended. The ingredients are exactly what's intended. And, especially if we're shifting into articular injections and things like that, you can practice safely.
Super. And just a couple of the quality markers, I think they're listed here on the slide, but are important to call out. We're talking about a certificate of analysis. That's for the raw materials that will go into what is the final compounded product. We're talking about pharmaceutical ingredients, the pharmaceutical grade API that is coming through a secure and accountable supply chain. And of course, you yourself are a licensed compounding pharmacist, which those are three items that may not be represented in other access channels in Canada.
Correct. And I would actually advise people against even using a COA or certificate of analysis to base whether something's safe. Most of these products are coming from overseas, and COAs are often forged. And also there's issues with storage. Chain of custody, I guess, is something else people need to consider too, because you might be getting a great product from wherever you've sourced it from, and then it gets stored in some crate somewhere at whatever temperature, and the product itself can be destroyed or contaminated just from that. So a certificate of analysis is just a small part of the overall, I guess, process. So the fact that we are a licensed compounding pharmacy and we have to adhere to our college guidelines, Health Canada guidelines, and more importantly, NAPRA guidelines around sterility and chain of custody of all these products, independent third-party testing by batch or lot number, as Dr. Pagdin alluded to, is, well above and beyond, if you were to order something like this and just say, oh, can I have a COA? To justify what it is, that doesn't really mean anything once you get the product in your hands.
Now, Chris, I have a question for you that came from one of the attendees here, and that is, in order for you to dispense a vial of BPC 157 to a patient, do you need to have a prescriber's prescription?
So particularly with the injectable products, we are asking for prescriber's prescription. Now, we don't, as a pharmacy, we don't want to be also telling people that to take this for this indication. That's out of our scope anyway. And, you know, as these things are coming out of kind of a research-based model, we have to approach things with abundance of caution. So yes, we are asking for prescriptions. At this point, topical GHK Cu, I'm comfortable dispensing without an official prescription because it is present in a lot of medical grade cosmetics. So, you know, there's other products on the market in lower concentrations, obviously, not exactly what we're dealing with. But yes, so right now, particularly with injectable BPC, and then with any form of sermorelin, whether it's the injectable or the sublingual troches, yes, we do require a prescription.
Right. Now, the traditional justification for being able to compound these things is if there is no currently approved product that does exactly what these products do. So are we sort of in that arena there? Is that why you're able to justify compounding these things?
Yes, absolutely. Like opening a compounding pharmacy in general was something that was a passion of mine. You know, to be able to improve products and supply patients with items that just aren't available or not available anymore. There's a lot of products we compound that used to be available and there was no commercial market for them. And so they were discontinued and now we're able to source the APIs and make them themselves. So yes, there's no, you know, there is no commercial source of these products available. So yes, we're able to compound.
Yeah, excellent. So the caution to the providers here is that the use of unapproved drugs does carry with it certain regulatory, professional, and liability risks that differ significantly from the off-label use of an approved medication. So you just got to keep that in mind. And you need to inform your patients and really thoroughly document the informed consent discussion.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, like BPC is essentially approved as a natural health product of sorts or a supplement. Like just to reiterate what you said, like Health Canada doesn't necessarily have an official indication for it, but that's also standard Health Canada protocol. Anything that doesn't have rigorous clinical trials, they tend not to touch. And you know, on one hand, depending on how you look at it, that can be frustrating. But on the other hand, they're allowing us to work with it, and you know, that's a sign that we are transitioning to standard practice, in my opinion. And once again, people are seeking these products anyway. Physicians are beginning to prescribe them, especially in functional medicine practices. And my mission is to provide a safe product, you know, at the concentration that you're expecting, the right product, not a contaminated product, and then a product too that's actually completely sterile. The other thing to remember that the products that people are receiving off the gray market, they're literally suspending themselves. And, you know, you can just imagine the risks that, you know, that are occurring out there.
Absolutely. So we'll kind of be wrapping things up here. Wanted to key in on these points here on this slide. Be aware of the regulatory status. These are not Health Canada approved therapeutics. You can't advertise them to your patients as having a specific therapeutic indication because there really isn't one at this point. Patients need to understand this. Document your informed consent. If you feel that this is a product where there is no other approved product that can do what this peptide does, and you do the informed consent, and you source out a quality product, and you register your patient in an outcome tracking tool, then you are doing the basic fundamental ingredients required to be able to do research. So these are the key things that we are supporting our members in the Canadian Peptide Research Society with. We will provide you with informed consent documents with quality products, exactly how to get them. And we've set up these RegenMed circles inside the Canadian Peptide Research Society. We've got 3 of them right now. We have a circle for tracking data for MSK applications with BPC 157. We have a circle for tracking data for GI applications in BPC 157. And the third one is for tracking skin healing in using GHK copper. This is a slide here that shows you what the typical circle looks like. And you can see my cases that I've enrolled. I did a couple of cases in December, about 4, I think, in January. and then close to another dozen in February. So I don't have outcomes to show you yet, but these are the patients that are enrolled in my MSK circle at this point. Now, you could imagine if a number of other providers join the same circle and we each have a handful of patients, well, very quickly, we're going to have a relatively large cohort that we can be tracking outcomes, both good and bad, in validated symptom tracking tools.
Thank you for that, Grant. And again, just to reiterate, so many of us will be at CHASM in Kelowna, Grant's practices in Kelowna, Chris's pharmacy is in Kelowna. So we definitely want to create an opportunity for people to be able to, if you will be attending CHASM and want to learn more, we're going to have a Q&A section in just a few moments here, but definitely if you're going to be at CHASM, please stop by on the Friday afternoon. And prior to that, at noon on Friday, we are hosting our Innovations in Orthobiologics Symposium that is going to draw from some of the discussion today and looking at standardization and looking at sequencing, orthobiologics, and all of the tools in your toolkit. So covering topics like platelet dose thresholds, product sequencing with PRP, HA, and some of these other assets, and ultimately providing you with clinical evidence-based protocols. So definitely be sure to attend that and then come stop by the booth afterwards to speak with Grant and Chris. Now, I've been seeing all of the questions that have been getting populated here into the chat as well as into the Q&A. Grant, I don't want to volunteer you for a whole bunch of time here, but let's try to get through what we can. I think first up, we do have some more discussion on the concerns regarding the systemic angiogenic effect that may or potentially increase the vascular support of slow-growing tumors, therefore concern for carcinogenic effect. I know you touched on that briefly, but maybe just elaborate a little bit more on what you see there.
Yeah, so in the preclinical work in animals, that's not been shown to happen. So they have not been able to show an increase in tumor growth or the incidence of tumors with the use of either BPC 157 or GHK copper. So angiogenesis is context dependent is basically the answer.
Perfect. And then when you look at ongoing administration versus targeted case-specific use, I'm sure this is something that many clinicians are being asked by their patients. Do you see any pros, benefits, risks associated with the ongoing prolonged use for chronic conditions versus acute targeted settings?
Yeah, most providers are suggesting that there is kind of a length of time that you could use these things continuously, after which point you should take a little bit of a break. So again, we don't have a firm consensus. Some providers would suggest take it for 8 weeks and take 6 or 8 weeks off. My personal preference is to take it for perhaps up to 12 weeks and then take at least 2 to 3 weeks off. Anywhere in there. But I think what we find is with continuous use, certainly out beyond 12 weeks, diminishing returns. So giving your body a little bit of a break and then coming back to it seems to make sense. Again, no firm consensus.
Okay. Next one, I'm going to actually combine 2 questions here because I think they relate to the same thing. But ultimately, how do patients access this from a pharmacy? Do they need a prescription? Can they just walk in, get it themselves? And then what are, as a physician, the legal aspects of writing that prescription when it's not approved by Health Canada?
Yeah, so I think Chris mentioned already he would require a prescription if it's going to be injectable BPC 157 or if it's going to be either sublingual or injectable sermorelin. If it would be topical GHK copper, he can use that because it's already available in various cosmetics. So topical GHK copper, no prescription, sermorelin or injectable BPC 157 would require a prescription. So now if a physician...
And oral BPC too as well.
And oral BPC as well needs a prescription. So here's the thing. If a physician is going to write a prescription for an unapproved drug, you've got to be very careful. You're on very thin ice, okay? Because you're exposing yourself to liability. So you need to very carefully consider whether there's a suitable alternative. You need to have that comprehensive, informed discussion with the patient. And then ideally, you would also be having a formal method of tracking outcome. So if you can document your robust consent discussion, and you can track the outcome with a verified tool, then at the very minimum, you are doing research. Okay, so to use a non-approved product or write a prescription for a non-approved product, you really need to be doing research.
And you need to be collecting the data. And that's ultimately the distinction with the discussions you've had with Health Canada, your experience in this space.
Yeah,
and that is where
absolutely.
CPRS can help.
If you're not doing that, like you're putting your license on the line.
And what do you see coming down the pipeline? Is anybody in Canada or even in North America, is there anything coming through the pipeline as far as high quality human control trials in the BPC 157 space or in the analogous peptide space?
Yeah, well, here's the problem, Connor. Because these substances occur naturally in our bodies, nobody can patent the molecule, okay? So that's why Big Pharma isn't interested in pursuing this. You know, when they make semaglutide, they don't patent the molecule, they patent the delivery system. So, you know, the little cartridge in the injection pen, that's what they patent, right? So these molecules can't be patented. So nobody's going to front a whole bunch of money hoping that when it comes to market, they can corner the market and have exclusive, you know, marketing capability, because very quickly, as soon as it's approved, every lab is going to be making it. So you can't expect to recoup the costs of your research by having an exclusive market. That's not going to happen. So the only way that we're going to be able to do a formal clinical research trial with a no objection letter from Health Canada is if we have some philanthropist that's not looking for a return on an investment, but is just prepared to front the money to move the science forward. As soon as the clinical trial is completed and Health Canada says, yes, it looks like it's safe and it looks like it's effective, now it can go to market, then everybody's going to start marketing it. So there's really not any money to be made in the field, which makes it the motivation to want to spend a bunch of money on doing research. There's no return on that, right?
And there's a follow-up question in the Q&A here, and maybe this will benefit others as well, but what do you mean by high dose PRP? And they use the term 5B, which is one of the sort of common nomenclature associated with standardizing PRP.
Yeah. So back in the days, our centrifuges were pretty mild. We do a single spin and we might get PRP that was 2.5x at best compared to baseline. And those early studies weren't showing PRP to be of very much benefit. Once we got centrifuges that could make PRP that were sort of 3.5 to 5x, well, then we started to actually get some therapeutic response. And those were the trials that were showing PRP was superior to cortisone or HA at 6 months. Now, we still see some trials coming out nowadays showing, oh yeah, PRP is no better than placebo. But when you dig into it, they were doing a single spin. They really weren't, you know, they were drawing 10 cc's of blood and giving people 4 cc's of PRP. Well, that's, you know, it's at best 2x PRP. So what we understand now is the dose of the platelets that you deliver is important. So if you have a platform that can generate you somewhere from 5x to 10x baseline, and you've got a, you know, a platelet count of 240,000, you know, then we're getting billions of platelets in you know 8 cc's after an 80 cc blood draw at pretty close to 10x. Then you're going to start to see the therapeutic response. So that's what we mean when we talk about high dose PRP. It's got to be double spin. It's got to be at least 5x baseline.
And again, just the 5B is a nomenclature that is being popularized around standardizing the dose of the platelets, the type of the concentration as well, if that's something that's unfamiliar to people. A targeting question. One of the main concerns that some physicians have is how do we know these products signal only the abnormal tissues that they are trying to regenerate, especially with respect to stimulating the nitric oxide system, which inhibits heme insertion into hemoglobin. Upregulating nitric oxide has also been implicated in neurodegenerative conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which is already increasing in our aging population.
Yeah, that's a good question here. And I did have some notes specifically about nitric oxide. Let's see if I can find that. That might be a question that I would have to come back to. And my understanding is, yeah, I can't find exactly the reference, but my understanding is that the effect on nitric oxide levels again, depends on the context. It can either increase or decrease nitric oxide depending on the pathological context. So it acts as more of a homeostatic regulator of nitric oxide rather than always being an upregulator or a downregulator. That's the simple answer. Sorry, I don't have the reference at my fingertips.
Mm-hmm. And I believe it's Dr. Prasad, you will be at CHASM, if I'm not mistaken, and so maybe there's an opportunity to connect once Grant's had an opportunity to review his notes on that. But definitely a very, very good question. Another one that I think is really important for us to address, or for obviously you, Dr. Pagdin, to address, when it comes to counseling youth patients who are injecting peptides on epidemic basis, in this clinician's opinion, to support their workouts. You mentioned bodybuilders, they've been using these assets for decades, but they have no problem getting them from unregulated sources. Chris has already spoken to some of the risks associated with that. What are you doing specifically to consult patients that maybe don't want to go through some of these approved channels and say, you know, I want to be using them, no ifs, or buts, I don't mind where I get them from?
Right. So bottom line is buyer beware. Okay. You know, these things are available, but sources are important. Now, I don't have a particular, you know, kind of gray market source that I can honestly recommend. I have looked at some of these third-party certificates. I don't know how valid they are. They come from labs in Europe. When I've seen some of these peptide products that patients bring to me, what it says right on the label is for research purposes only. There's some powder in there. There's no lot number. There's no expiry date. There's nothing to indicate, you know, what's actually in that vial. So I think people are putting themselves at substantial risk. They may be able to perceive a benefit. They may be able to get by with very little or no harm, but I don't really know what they're taking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Well, I think that covers all of the questions that we had, and I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Pagdin. Just in closing, if anybody wants to connect with Dr. Pagdin, if you will be attending CHASM, please do connect with him as well as Chris there Friday afternoon. Please join us at the lunch symposium on Friday as well. The MD Biologics team will be following up with everybody who is registered and as well as is on this call, and those that were not on this call able to join us. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar as well as more information for how you can get involved with CPRS. If there's any disconnect between speaking with Dr. Pagdin or you are curious about where this may fit into your toolkit or some of the regulatory concerns, please connect with anybody at the MD Biologics team, and we will certainly be a conduit to get you into the hands of professional advice from the CPRS team as well as Dr. Pagdin. Dr. Pagdin, any closing remarks before we let you off for the evening?
No, I was just very impressed with the number of folks that signed up. Clearly, that means this is a hot topic. And yeah, I hope to be able to share with you further information as it becomes available. Thanks very much for your time and attention. And it was really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for hosting, Connor. And I'm glad you could join us, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Super. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.